Oh no. Well, then you should cover them. Well, that's a detail from your office.
He does. He does. That's his first step.
Before or after, there's talk of this.
There's talk way back the office in Darfur. We are.
Especially we just finished thought, and then the second meeting is on force and General Scowcroft to resolve it.
Yes.
So,
That'd be a lot. Well, I would like to do that. See, yeah, some direction. But the problem is well, we need to have a commission for those governments. To be brutal. But it was
My name is
Anna North. You look very familiar to me when I
How are you? I'm Jean Wolf.
Nothing like that.
things like all the security council members and that's the there.
Where were you in UN?
Not saying anything. Not saying
I've been there for a
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay, well,
so,
then you can have
I
some
did
kind of-
evaluation.
It is, but it's. So this is.
Keeping low key. Oh, I did a little evaluation in Iraq.
Oh, yeah, it's really big.
Not today, not today.
I see.
Running stuff.
for the
No, it would be 30.
how does it look for the these elections?
Optimistically thinking.
It's so complicated.
But every, I think there's pressure that discrimination, in spite of everything, of the Iraqi people, what I felt when I was in charge of things. It was, but it was expensive, but I think it's there. I trained them, surgeons and
So rather than talking to David,
a lot of damage.
touch
No.
it.
And that's quite what we hear.
I never interacted. No, I don't see it.
That's right, yeah.
I don't see all of it.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
Yeah.
and I said, really, how should I explain what he did? I said, yes, saying that for ages we have been in the society. And he said, just tell me, what moral claim was moral temple.
You had a big role in it.
Everybody was watching this.
He said, I know it was wrong. So I said, he was a member of parliament.
Oh, I heard that.
That's how we boxing.
That's right. Change this. Break the pattern.
I read this.
500 years ago.
I used to know.
Okay.
So I watched that story.
Just to save us costs. I think it will fill up.
Well, you know, this was our seat before you guys came.
I made
Came out
that.
to That's all right.
Russia?
Yeah.
I'm not getting out of
They lost about optionist.
No. That's right. I thought the French was not very good.
I got a little tidbit.
I mean, I did hear that they're doing a similar thing.
He was talking about SPLA.
Like, now they're
Yeah. There might. I mean, you know, we had precedent. And what had actually happened was, you know, India was under sanctions for nuclear research. And they had brought British but it was licensed under American law. And so our sanctions were through British sanctions. There was actually an instance where a sailor on a ship in the Indian Ocean had appendicitis. The Indians had to fly the helicopter to the airline and take him off base from the operator. So we said, thank you, we really appreciate it. Well, yes, actually. We had to cannibalize 3 of our helicopters to go to fly out there to do that.
Oh.
9/11 happened and they ship. So we started cooperating. So I know there have been instances of that, but In many ways, you know, that's the liars.
All right.
Everybody did. I mean, even in Cambodia. But we're talking like a mill observer, though, right? Not foreign units. I mean, they could have contributed trade units, you know, like there's no reason why you would have service. And I don't think we did. I think so. I'm off the top of my head, like I said, I don't know about it. I don't think so. I mean, if you listen, the largest trip in Iraq, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, shock, I think they actually look at each other's relative lists and add another 50 guys to the Sierra Leone machine too, because it keeps rotating every year. With balls up there. And yeah, we have an argument. What else? Tourism. There's no reason why that should happen. Still They have all these pictures of yeah, one hopes. That's where they're made. That's where they're made. So let's see. That's the one I bought.
You know, he is. Me neither. I think there may be one or two more people in the back trying to make their way in, and if not, I think everything is set up in our overflow room so they can hear us. Hi, my name is Anita Sharma, and I direct the Conflict Prevention Project here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And for those of you unfamiliar with the Woodrow Wilson Center, it was established by an act of Congress in 1968 and is the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. As a distinguished scholar, President Wilson was the only American with a doctorate, president, and a national leader. Wilson felt very strongly that the scholar and that practitioner should be engaged in a common enterprise. And through that, the mission of the center is to commemorate the ideals and concerns of President Woodrow Wilson by providing a link to the world of ideas and the world of policy by fostering research, study, and discussion collaboration among a full spectrum of individuals concerned with policy and leadership in national and world affairs. We are a nonpartisan, non-ideological center. This meeting today is co-sponsored by the Africa Program and the Conflict Prevention Project here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The director of the Africa Program, Howard Wolpe, is actually out of the country, and so I will be taking the helm today. The Africa Program was launched in 1999 through generous support of the Ford Foundation. And the program capitalizes on the center's location in Washington, D.C. to promote a dialogue among policymakers and academic specialists on both African issues and U.S. policy toward Africa. Presently, the Africa program is composed of 4 core elements: It runs a public forum and meetings series here in Washington. It also has a fellowship and award program to bring leading African and African scholars to the Wilson Center, and a congressional staff forum designed to inform policymakers on key issues facing the continent, and a major capacity building initiative in Burundi. The Conflict Prevention Project broadens the understanding of how hard-edged policy analysis and path-breaking research can help build capacity and expertise while influencing decision-making at the local, regional, and international levels. We have several significant ongoing projects, including Preventing the Next Wave of Conflict, which is looking at how we can understand non-traditional threats to global stability. And that's a series examining how economic and social disparities, demographic trends, failures in governance, environmental degradation, and natural resource problems, as well as health crisis, can be destabilizing and have implications for international security. We also started a discussion series on the recently released UN high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change, and that's intended to spur discussion on the UN, its role, and changes needed to improve its performance with the UN and the United States. I'll get to more of that in a second. And we also have a series on More Than Victims, which is looking at the role of women in conflict prevention. Let me just tell you a little bit about some of our upcoming meetings. This Wednesday at 10 a.m. in the fifth floor conference room, one floor down, the Africa program is going to be joined by the Environmental Change and Security Project. It's going to host a meeting called Gaining Ground, Family Planning and Maternal Child Health in Africa, Lessons from Preliminary Findings on Madagascar's New Demographic Health Survey. And on Monday, February 14th, from 10 to 11:30 in this room, it's going to be the first of our four-part meeting series on the UN's high-level panel, as I mentioned. And this particular panel is going to address peace-building efforts, how to respond, and who will manage post-conflict situations. The panelists are another member of the International Crisis Group, Gareth Evans. He's the president, and a member of the high-level panel, Carlos Pascual, who is the coordinator in the Office of Reconstruction and Stabilization in the U.S. State Department, and General William Nash, who is the director for the Center of Preventive Action at the Council on Foreign Relations. And so if you want any more information about those programs, you can be in touch with me or see Julia Bennett, who is a project assistant with the Conflict Prevention Project, or Michael Jobbins, who is with the Africa program. And they're both here, and I'd like to thank them today for helping to put this meeting on. And relating to Sudan, you can find specific information on our website. We've had two really interesting meetings recently. One is the challenges of post-conflict economic recovery and reconstruction in the Sudan, and that was a paper that was presented at the Wilson Center in September by Lu Eldang, who is a senior economic advisor to the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement. And then we also had a delegation of Sudanese women who came from all over Sudan, from the north, south, and west primarily, called Peace in Sudan, Women Making a Difference. And those are policy recommendations by them, which was drafted here when they were in Washington. That was a co-sponsored meeting with Women Waging Peace. And I think some of those are outside for you. We are pleased to bring you here for a special briefing by John Prendergast, who is a special advisor to the president of the International Crisis Group. John's just returned from the region, and he's going to focus on the relationship between the current crisis in Darfur, the recent peace agreement in southern Sudan, and the ongoing trans-border conflict between the Ugandan government and the Lord's Resistance Army. And indeed, there is much to discuss. Just this past weekend, an opposition group from Sudan's increasingly unstable east called on Sunday for more power and resources to the impoverished region, which is echoing demands made by other anti-Khartoum forces in Africa's largest country. They see an accord signed in January between the government and the southern rebels of the SPLA as a model for their own region. Also over the weekend, Sudan's regime declared that no one accused of crimes against humanity in the war-torn region of Darfur would be handed over to face trial with the International Criminal Court. Here they are in agreement with the U.S. State Department, which has said it favors other avenues for bringing suspected Darfur war criminals to justice, including the use of the International Criminal Tribunal set up in Tanzania to try Rwandan genocide suspects. A recent UN panel investigated the conflict and concluded that while genocide was not taking place, war crimes and crimes against humanity had been committed. The conflict in Darfur, described by the UN as one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, erupted in 2003, and it has killed tens of thousands of people and uprooted as many as 1.85 1.85 million, many who are internally displaced and others who have fled to neighboring Chad. Also last week, in a report to the Security Council, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan recommended the deployment of a peace support operation in Sudan, consisting of more than 11,000 troops and civilian police. This follows on the signing of in 9 January of a comprehensive peace agreement to end the 21-year-old civil war between the Sudanese government and the SPLM. And finally, some good news, there may be a window of opportunity in Uganda, where the war in the north has been ongoing for 18 years, claiming thousands of lives and forcing at least 1.6 million people from their homes. Negotiations that had been expected to end the conflict were aborted in December of 2004, but on the 3rd of February, the government said it would halt military operations against the LRA for 18 days on the condition that they confine themselves to a designated area as efforts to revive the peace talks continue. As I mentioned, John is going to help us make sense of all of these very complex issues. A leading African expert, John Prendergast, is a special advisor to the president of the International Crisis Group, and John has focused most of his 20-year career on conflict resolution in Africa and shaping U.S. foreign policy toward the region. He has served as a special advisor to the State Department and was the director of African Affairs at the National Security Council. He's the author of 7 books, including Frontline Diplomacy, Humanitarian Aid, and Conflict in Africa. And he was the principal author of the International Crisis Group seminal report, Oil, God, and Country, Changing the Logic of War in Sudan. On John's most recent trip to the region, he accompanied Paul Rusabanya, who is the manager of the Hotel Mille Collines, which is better known, I think, in the recent movie Hotel Rwanda. And along with them also was Oscar nominee Don Cheadle. And that segment is due to air on Nightline sometime this week. We don't have the exact date, but you can check your local listings. And with that, I'm going to hand the meeting over to John, and he'll give his presentation, at which time, after that, we can have a question and answer session. So again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, John.
Thank you, Anita. Now that you've given my talk, should we just go straight into Q&A? I mean,
we need your perspective. I was just outlaying the facts.
Thank you so much for that. Well, I've been gone for a long time and seen a lot of stuff, and I have way, way too much to say, so it's a very dangerous cocktail. If you're the conflict prevention specialist, if you see the crowd is beginning to turn ugly and I'm going a little too long, just work some kind of a little motion and noise, something, but not those notes. Just don't.
And that's why I had him by himself. He's alone on the panel, so plenty of time.
Well, I'm coming back from this last trip was Somalia, Southern Sudan, Northern Uganda, Darfur, Chad, Naivasha, where the peace agreement was signed, and Los Angeles. We'll leave the very last part out of it, and leave Somalia out of it for another time, and talk about the middle 5 places. I'm increasingly convinced that the resolution of these, particularly the 3 crises of Southern Sudan, Darfur, and Northern Uganda, are intimately interlinked. The current policy of trifurcation, of dealing with each of these conflicts and problems separately, I think will ensure that the wars will continue or resume in all these places over time. This is symbolized by calling this peace agreement that was just signed between the government and the SPLA a comprehensive peace agreement. There's nothing comprehensive about the process involving 2 of the armed actors in the country, full of armed and unarmed actors. There's nothing comprehensive about the result, which deals principally with the South, the Nuba Mountains, and Southern Blue Nile. So if we're going to get implementation in Southern Sudan and end once and for all that legacy of tremendous conflict, and if we're ever going to get resolution in Darfur and Northern Uganda, we're going to need to deal with all 3 of these in a comprehensive way that ties together and coordinates the processes and the results of the 3 in a more focused and deliberate manner than is presently being done. Let's start this saga in the South, where we shouldn't forget that 30 times as many people have died in the course of that war during the last 20 years that have perished in Darfur. The signing of the deal, despite the fact that it isn't comprehensive, is a very important achievement. It's a very complex, very detailed agreement with real security guarantees for the SPLA. It gives unity a chance, after all the rhetoric. I wish Francis Deng was here to tell us how it does. I think it certainly is an important emphasis of the agreement. But it also protects Southerners and the Nuba people from a possible double cross by the ruling party, the National Islamic Front. And double cross is definitely possible. In my view, the government signed the deal in Naivasha, the deal between it and the SPLM, partly and predominantly to deflect further international pressure, which was and continues to build, was building and continues to build over its ongoing military activities and the atrocities that it's committing and is responsible for in Darfur. The government hoped, I think, that a window of international goodwill would result for quite some time in the aftermath of the agreement. They got that, and they still have it in some quarters. And they've used it to increase their attacks in Darfur, as we've seen, and to further undermine opposition throughout the country. And all of you no doubt have seen what Anita referred to at the outset about the eastern rebels and what happened in Port Sudan last week when the government opened fire on a demonstration. This is the kind of stuff we're going to see plenty of. The government objective, the Sudan government's objective is, as I hope all of you know by now, to maintain power by any means necessary, and that any means necessary certainly goes far beyond what most governments in the world are willing to do. But they also pursue what are seemingly contradictory approaches in different parts of the country with different elements of the opposition to confuse outsiders and to defuse criticism. It's a divide and conquer strategy, and it's a divide and confuse strategy. So on the one hand, they're signing a peace deal with the SPLM, increasing their military attacks in the west, in Darfur, increasing repression in the east against certain elements of the National Democratic Alliance, while they're negotiating in Cairo with other elements of the National Democratic Alliance. So it's not a simple strategy. Now, when we're looking more specifically at the government SPLA peace deal, the implementation period of 6.5 years before the referendum for the South is going to be ripe, of course, with opportunities for spoilers to steer the parties towards renewed confrontation and renewed conflict. I hope at some point we can do a whole session on the implementation process, but I'd like to highlight what I think the biggest spoiler is, and that is the intentions and the tactics of both the parties, both the government and the SPLA, during this interim period. First, the government. Aside from not really wanting to share power, and aside from not really wanting to divide the oil money, and aside from not really wanting to hold the referendum, I think the government is fully on board with this deal. Seriously, key hardliners in the National Islamic Front will obstruct this agreement every day of the next 6.5 years, principally through their favorite tactic, which is predictably divide and conquer. They will look to exploit intra-South, intra-Southern divisions, and especially will look to use the elections in 3 to 4 years and the pro-government militias, particularly Nuer, in the oil fields and throughout Upper Nile, to stir the pot, particularly after year 3. I think we're going to see a grace period for the South initially, while the government concentrates most of its military efforts in Darfur, and if they need to, in the East. So we'll see very little of this to lull us into a sense of complacency. And just mark these words. Year 3, you're going to see an upsurge in support for militia activity in the South to demonstrate with the NIF premise, which is the South is ungovernable and thus will not be able to hold its referendum. To coin a phrase from Paul Collier, there is plenty of greed and grievance to exploit in the South to allow that intra-Southern rivalry to burn. Now, the SPLA is not will not be blameless either in this interim period. And I think we have to look very, very soberly at the fault lines that exist as a result of the organization and in the history of this rebel movement. There are huge capacity questions, first and foremost, and that's obvious. How will they fill all these positions? They're going to be 1/3 of the central government. They're going to run a regional government in the south, which in effect is going to be an autonomous government with its own army, which is almost like a independent state. So that capacity question is probably the least of the problems. And though it's massive, there are much more important things that portend negatively for the implementation with regard to internal leadership issues within the SPLM that I assume will be nothing but exacerbated during the process leading up to the elections. Now you have a history, a legacy of an autocratic style of decision making, which of course is suitable for a rebellion. And is certainly what is needed when one needs that kind of internal cohesion and discipline. But for running a government, certainly it's going to require a sea change. And we've seen example after example in the region, in Ethiopia and Eritrea, Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo, where the difficulties of that transition from rebel movement to government has been exceedingly difficult. And you see that all the same guys that led their rebel movements are still presidents of their countries. You also have, probably most importantly, is questions around the willingness of the SPLA to share power and wealth internally within the southern regional government with other groups that have not been either allied with the SPLA or part of it. Again, greed and grievance are going to bedevil the South for the next 6.5 years and going forward. So it's a very cheap and short treatment of southern Sudan. We can certainly talk more about it in the discussion, but for the purposes of just kind of marching along here, we're going to move now to northern Uganda, where I spent a couple weeks meeting with the government of Uganda. Spent in most of the time in the north with UPDF, meeting with LRA, meeting with civil society, and particularly meeting with the excessively able mediator, Betty Bigambe. It is the best chance for peace in northern Uganda in the last 18 years, as Anita said at the beginning of the discussion. I think for a number of reasons. Here's your checklist of 7 reasons. First, there is momentum built up from the IGAD deal. There is an expectation that the Southern Sudan peace deal will allow for some positive reverberations. Say that one time, not even 3 times fast. That I think that that is a significant factor. The second is that the UPDF has become more effective in its military operations. And that is for a variety of reasons, which if people are interested, we can talk about. But suffice to say that their ability to triangulate and identify the positions of LRA units, particularly units led by some of the senior commanders who have been sought after now for many years, is improving, and which is a result of intelligence, and then the corresponding responsibility of the UPDF then to act on that intelligence because of increased mobility and particularly because of the attack helicopters has really got the LRA on the run. Third is the reduction, I don't know if it's ending, but it's certainly a reduction of support from the Sudan government to the LRA. There certainly is a great deal of difference of views, both in southern Sudan and northern Uganda, about whether the Sudanese regime had actually ended its support, and not that they couldn't start it again tomorrow. But this certainly the case that for a variety of reasons the Sudan government has reduced its support. Fourth, you have momentum built from civil society initiatives. The church leaders, the religious leaders, the parliamentarians, and other civil society elements have been deeply engaged now for the last decade and becoming more effective in their peace advocacy, and that has been very helpful. Fifth, you have, or sixth, God knows I'm very bad at lists. Is it 5? thank you, is the confidence-building measures that have been put forward by Museveni, particularly the 47-day ceasefire at the end of last year, and then again the 18-day one now. These are very important windows that allow for more dialogue to occur. Then sixth, you have pressure from the ICC, which is coming down like a freight train on people there in the north, on leaders in the LRA. And then finally you have, as I already said, a very able mediator in Betty Bigambe, who has the trust and confidence of the parties, who understands the issues better than anyone in the vicinity. The motivations, I think, and calculations of Joseph Kone, the leader of the LRA, will be crucial in determining whether the organization, and indeed northern Uganda as a whole, has a hard or has a soft landing. Up till now, he's been largely an enigma, as we know. I spent a lot of time with commanders of the LRA who had just come out for a variety of reasons, and literally just hours and hours and hours of interviews with these guys painted a very bizarre portrait of a man rooted in a really grotesquely distorted view of the Old Testament. He's seeking revenge for past transgressions by the government, especially in the immediate aftermath in '86, and what the UPDF at that time, the NRM did and NRA did in northern Uganda. And he's literally implementing the eye for an eye policy. He attacks civilian targets in the north almost exclusively because he says he's told by God to punish anyone who collaborates with this government, which he and that anyone is basically the entire population of northern Uganda, because of course the UPDF has pursued a strategy which arms civilian militias and tries to vest local populations in the counterinsurgency strategy, which then makes everybody a target. But Kone likens himself to Moses, bringing the Ten Commandments to a people who are largely deaf to his message, but who he is nevertheless leading to the Promised Land, which is defined as overthrowing the current southern-controlled government. And he perceives himself to be a prophet, receiving visions and cleansing evil spirits. And even Moses, he says to his people, was forced to kill someone. And like Moses, he doesn't believe he'll make it to the Promised Land, which provides a very dangerous ambiguity to whether he will ever allow himself personally to be part of the peace process. So far, he's sanctioned Joseph Kolo, who probably is number 3 in the hierarchy to be the negotiator for the LRA, and Vincent O.T., number 2, is in very frequent and close contact with Betty, but he personally, Kone, has not engaged directly, so he remains a major wild card. I think robbed of their camps in southern Sudan because of the UPDF offensives and because of the cutoff or the reduction in support by the government of Sudan and the diminishment of those supply lines that used to come out of Torit and Juba, the LRA calculations have been altered fairly dramatically. It's composed, as you all know, of rank and file that are mostly abducted child soldiers who are held hostage by very sadistic commanders who themselves were, many of whom were abductees years ago. The LRA has now entered a survival mode. Its main focus is stealing food and abducting children to replace those that have been killed or captured or surrendered. However, this is, before we get too complacent, this is an organization with a long track record of bouncing back from near oblivion. The capacities and the capabilities to continue to wreak havoc and terrorize civilians has not gone away completely. They're constantly rearming, refitting, repositioning, and reorganizing. Complacency in this case would be deadly. Certainly, I think the one-bullet theory holds water, that if Kone were to be killed or captured, the LRA would unravel just like UNITA did when Savimbi was killed, or the RUF did when Sanko was captured. But banking on that one-bullet strategy would condemn, I think, northern Uganda to many more years of atrocities if that's the only strategy that's pursued, i.e. the military one. So continuing the military pressure is necessary, I think, in the overall strategy in dealing with Uganda. But pursuing a purely military solution, which many hardliners on both sides, particularly in the UPDF, would like to pursue, would have a number of adverse impacts. It would end up killing hundreds, possibly thousands, of more abducted children and LRA dependents. It would be much more expensive than pursuing the peace process, and it would make reconciliation much more difficult in the long run, both amongst the Acholi people and between the Acholis and the government. And those remaining in the bush will increasingly be made up of hardcore commanders who would continue to inflict serious damage on civilians, although they pose, as they do now, no strategic threat to the government. The issue in front of the parties now is a ceasefire proposal, which has been made by the government. The differences have been narrowed very, very closely to just the question of assembly points, where the LRA would actually congregate during a ceasefire to enable negotiations and to ensure that to ensure against LRA violations of the ceasefire. So we have to be prepared internationally to, if they do sign, and they could sign tomorrow, they could never sign, to rapidly deploy international monitors to these assembly points and to provide the kind of sustenance and shelter to the LRA units in those points so that they don't continue with their predatory activities. This monitoring, international monitoring, is crucial. Museveni told me directly in very long discussion about that he accepts the idea of international monitors, and I think it's very, very important that there be some discussion of how and who is going to deploy rapidly to be that security guarantee to allow the follow-on negotiations to continue. Because I think that if you got the ceasefire, you have a very achievable agenda at the peace table. The LRA has never articulated its own agenda, as you all know. But again, talking to these LRA commanders at great length, points to a very defined set of issues that plague or are of concern to the LRA leadership, particularly OT and CONI. First and foremost, the security. Quite simply, the security of the LRA leadership will be the paramount issue. They fear, the key guys fear, they've committed so many crimes, and they will face potential retribution or accountability from a number of different sources, from the international community through the ICC and through what they don't understand at all is this U.S. terrorism list that the LRA is on. They fear accountability from the government, which many of them believe is going to go back on its amnesty pledge, that it makes the pledge, baits them, and then switches and changes it, and 3 years from now or a year or whatever it is, would then throw them all in jail or worse. And then thirdly, and perhaps even most importantly to at least Vincent OT, we know, is the fear of accountability and retribution from the Acholi people themselves. You take a guy like the number 2 OT who butchered his own hometown, his home village, literally. I mean, killed almost everybody there on the border between Sudan and Uganda. And you know, these guys he sent feelers out. He sent people back to the local area to ask, you know, what would happen if I ever came back. They're concerned, excessively concerned about this issue of security, personal security. This is what it will come down to. The second issue, much more peripheral but not irrelevant, is what the ex-LRA combatants, not the leaders, but the combatants, what will happen to them once they come out of the bush. You see, this is completely devoid of a political or agenda. It may be there may be add-ons to it because of the politicians who will inevitably push their way into the talks somehow. But at this point, we're talking about very, very specific security issues. The LRA commanders I talked to came over are very concerned about the livelihoods of the rank and file and what would happen to them outside of the guerrilla context. And this is why this DDR, the Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration program, is so important to provide an incentive for people to come out peacefully. So, as usual, and if there's any World Bank representatives, I hope you hear this rather than I wish you didn't, the bank has taken months and months and months to release the funds that necessary to get this program of DDR started, to demonstrate that there is a serious program, there is a serious alternative to the gun out there for people coming out. Now, I blame the bank, of course, and anyone who would, because of the slowness and the bureaucracy and the red tape, but the Ugandan government has a bigger responsibility here. They need to fund the Amnesty Commission, which is overall in charge, the Ugandan institution that's in charge of implementing the DDR program. They need to fund that fully. They need to put a greater emphasis on that. As usual, Museveni talks a bigger game than he funds, and I think that it really is a seminal question and a symbol of whether or not this government in Kampala is serious or not about peace, as to what kind of support they provide to the Amnesty Commission. And if they were providing that support, I think it would be that much more glaring that the bank was not ready. But we hope that this will happen quickly. I think there are a few things quickly on northern Uganda that we need to be focused on, and we'll at some point talk more about the actual alternative policy. But I think there has to be a lot more international support and pressure for peace in northern Uganda, and these pressures and incentives need to be coordinated much more and integrated much more into the overall Sudan effort, as I said at the outset. First, we need to be ready with those international monitors, and we need, as a package, to, if there is a ceasefire, to have the aid available for the DDR so that we can start to see specific repercussions and greater assistance to the IDPs, because if all of our support and all of our effort is focused on how do we accommodate the LRA, again, the intra-Acholi, intra-North fault lines and resentments and bitterness towards what has happened over the last nearly 2 decades will only be exacerbated. So there has to be some peace dividend, even if it's just humanitarian. Second, in the first instance. Second, I think we need much greater diplomatic support for the efforts of Betty Bigambe, and this could be decisive. The U.S. is key in this. Right now there's a troika. Norway and the Netherlands and the Brits are providing direct support to the Bigambe mediation. The U.S. is not part of that for a number of reasons, but I think that if there was a senior official who came from Washington, I don't use the word envoy because it's such an anathema to this administration, but a senior official who came regularly from Washington to Uganda to demonstrate specific and serious and substantial support from the United States to the peace process in northern Uganda, this could literally be decisive. Museveni needs a partner. He needs somebody literally to hold his hand. And the LRA needs to know that the U.S. isn't hanging back and that they're going to sign some deal and then we're going to come out with our, terrorism list and our military assistance, which we've of course been providing, much less than what everybody thinks it is. And I think that would reassure the LRA that in fact it would be crucial for them to go forward. And I think thirdly, there are so many people within the system, key high-level political and military leaders in Uganda, who do smell blood and see erroneously the end in sight of the LRA if they pursue a purely military strategy. And I think having a senior envoy with military attaches, the way it should be, from the United States, going out, talking to the senior people, not just President Museveni, but a wider swath of people, and convincing them of the way forward, I think it would have a fairly major impact. So that's northern Uganda. We can move now to Darfur. And I think that we all have to recognize that it's a different phase of the game in Darfur now. Is the major ethnic cleansing operations that we saw in 2003 and 2004 are largely over, largely. So now the government is in its mop-up phase. I think there are 7 deadly trends that are extant now today in Darfur, and I want to go through those quickly with you to highlight what I think, and all of them are pointing to a deteriorating situation, and with little chance of reversal unless there's major international changes in policy. The first deadly trend is that the ceasefire it's the most blatantly obvious one. The ceasefire is in tatters. Violations continue for months now without consequence. The fighting in some cases moved eastward into the oil areas, and it raises the stakes, of course, in the conflict and ensures that there will be more blowback for any time there is a rebel operation. The second deadly trend is that raping and pillaging continue to increase and have done so since September. We had, I think, a short blip of improvement during the summer. This is not coincidental to the fact that during the summer the mandate for the African Union mission was being debated, discussed, and decided upon. And in the aftermath of the visits by Secretary Powell, Secretary General Annan, and the Secretary General of the AU, Kunare, there was an improvement in the situation. We saw the end of all those, or many of those, aid restrictions, the bureaucratic restrictions that the government was using to kill people. And then we saw a diminution of support of active direct support for Janjaweed attacks. But I think since September, the trend line has reversed fairly rapidly after the AU mission was decided upon, and it became a relatively toothless, meaningless operation focused on ceasefire monitoring rather than civilian protection, with the number of troops that was so small as to be of no consequence. After that was decided upon, you saw again a resumption of activities, and I think that the trend lines from field reporting regarding, and from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty particularly, that and anecdotal evidence from any number of people going in and out of these places demonstrates that the situation, the human rights situation, has deteriorated, particularly for those from the 3 main communities that have been targeted: the Fur, the Masalit, and the Zigawa. And I think this is part and parcel of the regime's plan. It is to stoke intercommunal conflict, to create a degree of autonomy to the conflict in Darfur, and hope that people think that at some point in the future that it's just intertribal violence that has just gone out of control, and thus again having the government step back from responsibility, direct responsibility for the continuing deterioration. It worked for some people. It worked in the South. You certainly had a preponderance of European governments for years saying that the intertribal violence in the South was one of the main reasons we couldn't get a peace deal. Just complete and total misanalysis. And we're going to see the same thing here as the situation in Darfur deteriorates. The third deadly trend is that the government is again turning to the Janjaweed to do its dirty work. Not one report that I've seen, I don't know about you, Jerry, anybody else in here, has seen of a credible effort by the Sudan government to disarm one Janjaweed militia member, or to arrest and hold accountable one legitimate Janjaweed official, commander or militia member. The attacks are increasingly, again anecdotally and from the human rights reporting and from the African Union reporting, backed again by aerial power, which is of course, very, very blatantly in disregard of all of the pledges that have been made, and demonstrate, I think, for all of us how little concern the government of Sudan has for international pressure as it's expressed at this point in the form of speeches by Secretary Powell, former Secretary Powell, or Jan Pronk, or whoever makes their speeches, or presidential statements from the Security Council. Fourth deadly trend is that humanitarian access is on the decline again. I think we're seeing two trends in the humanitarian arena. First is that we have an increase in the number of people who are being assessed to be at risk. That is a result of a deteriorating economic situation in Darfur. It's a result of direct fighting. It's as a result of continuing and increased attacks by all parties in the conflict. So you have this trend line of an increased number of people who are in need of assistance, and a slower rate of increase in the amount of assistance that's being put into the theater. So the gap between numbers in need of assistance and numbers of people being assisted is growing. So when the UN says we're increasing our assistance to people in Darfur, please read on in the fine print. The second trend that's important to note is we're seeing an increase in the abductions of local humanitarian staff. This is a very specific campaign by the government of Sudan to target relief organizations and humanitarian aid. And it's much more effective, in my view, than the bureaucratic restrictions were last year. Again, we just have to look at history and look at what happened in the South during Operation Lifeline Sudan. Whenever the government needed to, as a matter of military policy, restrict aid and use aid as a weapon of war, it would use the sort of tool of insecurity. In other words, if for example, in northern Bahr Ghazal, and Jamir has written extensively about this, in northern Bahr Ghazal in '98, not only did it prevent aid agencies and deny aid agencies assistance to provide assistance in these areas, but it also, in a number of those areas, would stoke insecurity or say that an area was insecure. And then if you rise up to level 3 or 4, or level 4, I can't remember the details of how the aid agencies have their systems, but if it goes up to level 4, then you just simply can't do operations in those areas. And if you were going to do operations in those areas and risking your own staff, the lives of your staff, then of course hardly anyone is willing or can do that. And you saw even now at this point, Save the Children has withdrawn from, Save the Children UK has withdrawn from Darfur, and others are considering it because of the dangers. So it's a deliberate strategy to use insecurity, use intimidation, harassment of aid officials, local mostly, although 4 internationals have been killed, though that's another story. And I think that this is a very, very significant thing to keep an eye on. Fifth deadly trend is that the government continues on a massive arms buildup in Darfur and a massive weapons buying spree in Khartoum. There continues to be no arms embargo, as you all know. In fact, there's an arms embargo on the rebels, just in case. And the government did indeed demonstrate its disdain for the international pressures and for the peace process when the first day of the last round of peace talks, which was in mid-December, the government launched a minor but significant offensive in West Darfur at the same time, literally the day that the talks started, which led to the abortion of the talks. The sixth deadly trend is that the rebels are fragmenting. The command and control has largely been shot to pieces because of the very effective strategy of the government of Sudan. I mean, they didn't just commit genocide and ethnic cleansing in western Sudan for the fun of it. I mean, the strategy has been to drain the water to catch the fish. The strategy is the oldest counterinsurgency strategy in the book, and it's very effective when it's successful, and it's been devastatingly successful in Darfur, where you've cleared out the civilian population from most of the areas from which the rebels were operating. They have no sanctuary in most places. There's very small little units here and there where they can hide. But generally speaking, their ability to move has been gravely compromised by a very successful military campaign, which happened to commit genocide in the same time. Now, the rebels, that's not to absolve the rebels of responsibility. They have increasingly been observed to be committing human rights abuses. Their leadership is certainly in crisis. There's a very great division. I have no idea what today's news is going to be, but certainly over the last few days, there has been a power struggle underway in the SLA between various factions. And this is all sort of at the top, but it hardly means anything because the guys on the ground no longer listen to these people. So what this means not only is that we have unraveling in the field, but it also means that the potential for the rebel groups, particularly the SLA, to deliver at the negotiating table is being compromised by this period of instability. The seventh deadly trend is that the peace talks themselves are stagnant and really not going anywhere. They lack the commitment of the parties. That's quite overwhelmingly obvious. But I think they also lack the leverage of the mediators. This whole strategy to say, let the African Union do everything, which is being touted by the African Union as their strategy. It's not like everybody just cut their losses and said, let them do it, is simply insufficient. I mean, it is absolutely imperative that you have African leadership in these negotiations processes, but it's also just as imperative, and again, let's look at the experience in Africa during the last decade. It's just as imperative to have senior, significant, high-level support from key countries that matter in the region. And right now, in my view, it's not enough to send junior officers to the peace talks in Abuja. We need to have a senior envoy who goes in and demonstrates again that the U.S. is serious about these peace process, and we would be actively engaged in the development of the ideas as we were in the South. I mean, the Naivasha process is for it on a technical level in terms of how it was carried out, and there are many issues that we can get into that were problems. But that certainly it was a very good role model for how the Abuja process ought to unfold, where you had a troika of high-level representatives from the U.S., the Brits, and the Norwegians who were engaged on a daily basis with the parties in close coordination with a very significant and senior diplomat from the Kenyan government, General Sambewo, who had the full confidence of the entire IGAD region. I mean, that was saying a lot. That took a long time to build. We were working on that since '97 when I worked for Clinton. And finally, in 2001, we got the mediator we wanted. And then, over time, the president of this country made a commitment to making that peace deal a priority, and that was a crucial thing. We've got to do the same thing in Darfur. So just to conclude, or getting closer to conclusion, we, I think, need to focus in Darfur on three priorities, and it's very simple. And I'm a broken record on this stuff because I don't believe much in changing view unless the situation on the ground changes, but the situation on the ground has been fairly held very steady. So you're going to hear me say these things ad nauseum. The first is civilian protection. The African Union force, I've already said, completely inadequate mandate, completely inadequate force level. They need very simply to increase the number of forces and to expand the mandate to civilian protection. If they want to make a difference in Darfur, both those things have to happen because right now it's a big waste of money. Second, we need war crimes accountability, and this is going to be a very, very interesting debate that unfolds over the next month now. I don't know how long it's going to take, but and I think accountability on two fronts. And the first one, of course, is going to be this debate about what international legal instrument ultimately will hear the cases of those in Sudan who have been accused of crimes against humanity. Whether the U.S. position of a very confused position of a tribunal that somehow involves the African Union and the tribunal in Arusha and blah, 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 or which completely contradicts everything Pierre and Secretary Powell have said for the last few years about these tribunals? Or will it be the referral? Will the U.S. step aside and allow the referral to the International Criminal Court, which is the right thing to do? The real test, I think, of how serious the U.S. government is about Darfur will be in how quickly it comes to agreement with Europe. If this thing goes on and on, this dispute, because it very well could get hung up in lockdown in the context of a number of other disagreements with the Europeans, that this could go on for a while, then we'll know. The answer is, we use the G word, but we don't really want to walk the walk after we've talked the talk. So I think that will be a determination. That will demonstrate very quickly whether we're interested or not in Darfur. The other accountability mechanism, though, and it's not, in my view, absolutely essential that we only pursue a tribunal approach to the Darfur situation, but also, and you've heard this many times before, we need targeted sanctions against the government of Sudan, and three that are the most important and urgent. And any one of these, I think, would change their calculations sufficiently to end the worst vestiges of atrocities in Darfur. You have the travel freeze, something that was very effective against the government in the 90s for terrorism purposes, when the Security Council, after the President Mubarak assassination attempt, imposed sanctions, travel bans on senior leaders. Had a number of repercussions, rapid policy changes on the terrorism front. So we have a demonstrated track record with these very officials of this regime that they will respond to this kind of international pressure, yet we haven't even put it forward yet in any serious way. So I think the travel ban, asset freeze against specific regime businesses who are incorporated and who do business and which do business abroad, even if we start researching those companies, that will send the signal that the days of impunity are over. And then thirdly, arms embargo. It remains probably more stunning to me than anything else in this entire fiasco of the international response to Darfur. That 23 months into Darfur's crisis and 21 years into the war in the South, that there has never been on the tables of the Security Council a proposal to embargo arms sales to the government of Sudan. So I think using any one of those instruments will have an impact on the calculations of the regime. And I know that the Congress is actively pursuing now a bill that would put some of these things into more direct legislative force, building on last year's very good bill. And then finally, of the three priorities, we got civilian protection, we got accountability, and I think we need comprehensive peace. We need to pursue much more aggressively and diligently, as I said, revamping the process that exists in Abuja and getting senior U.S. leadership in the form of some kind of an envoy or whatever they want to call it. And so I think that as you can see, with these three intertwined conflicts, Southern Sudan and Darfur and in northern Uganda, it's going to require much more attention, much more effort, and much more coordination than exists presently. We're going to have to walk and chew gum and whistle all at the same time. We need to understand that if any one of these regions is left burning, any one of these three regions left burning while we try to pursue resolution in the other two or even one, the rest of the territory could and probably will catch fire. And if we continue to deal with these three crises in a piecemeal way, we will ensure that the fire will never be extinguished completely. Thank you.
Thanks, John. It was very insightful and provocative as usual. I'd expect nothing less from you. Why don't we open it up for questions from the audience. I'll identify, if you can identify yourself, that would be helpful. Let me just ask the first question, John, and take you back to the Secretary General's suggestion about the deployment of peacekeeping forces. Even though that was just announced recently, surprise, surprise, there have been very few countries which have stepped up to offer contributions. So whether you see there's any possibility of that. And then secondly, they've outlined perhaps going a step beyond what the African Union was suggesting in terms of protecting civilians, but then how that would work, whether there is the comprehensive solution that you're talking about, because I hadn't seen anything in terms of going beyond the scope of the Sudanese ceasefire. So,
yeah, the idea now is to deploy roughly 10,000 troops in support of the peace deal in the IGAD peace deal between the SPLA and the government. At this point, there are two problems. One is what you referenced, that there are not enough volunteers. That's normal. But the other fairly significant problem is not going to go away, is that those that have volunteered are ones that appear to be probably unacceptable to one of the two parties, to the SPLA. And as you see, the preponderance of forces would come from Muslim countries and from countries that are investors in the Sudanese oil sector. And this has created a very big conundrum for the SPLA leadership, as to whether to go ahead and accept this deployment just so that there will be an international force there, with the concomitant risk that these forces will be somewhat biased from their perspective towards Khartoum in the implementation process. And when the expectation and desire of the international community is that this mission, this international peace observation mission, will be first and foremost a monitoring element that has to be as unbiased and has to be as assiduous in its carrying out its responsibilities as possible, then one gets the sense that the SPLA is not going to back down on this anytime soon, because they're going to demand that there is a wider set of actors that are part of the international force. Now, at this point, the connection to the African Union is, to sort of to people who just landed from Mars and see what's going on in Sudan. There's a huge war in Darfur and a peace deal in Sudan, and we have maybe 2,000 troops mustered so far for Darfur, with a mandate that is less robust than the 10,000 troops that will go to a place that's made peace. It seems a little strange on the optics side, but that's the way it is. That's the way we work. And the connections at this point between the African Union mission and the UN mission are being explored and subject to a great deal of discussion, so that there is preparation and potential, if there were a peace deal in Darfur, that the coordination between the mission that is deployed in the south and Nuba Mountains and southern Blue Nile would be maximally tied to that in Darfur. But as of now, there are two different missions, two different leadership chains with two different mandates.
Thank you, John. My name is Ben Latigo. I'm from the University of the District of Columbia. I'm interested in the situation regarding northern Uganda. I am quite involved in that process with Mrs. Bete Bigombe. Both of us are from Uganda. I just spoke to her about 2 hours ago, and I will be talking to her again after this meeting. With regard to northern Uganda, it is interesting that while we talk about southern Sudan, the Darfur region, and northern Sudan, one thing which has been missing in the element on northern Uganda is the absence of the involvement of IGAD, the AU, as well as the UN in this issue. I'm aware that about 3 years ago, Senator Danforth traveled to Gulu in northern Uganda and actually offered an extension of IGAD to cover northern Uganda. However, at that time, President Museveni was not interested. In fact, he was not interested in seeing he was not interested in seeing monitors in northern Uganda. I think part of this problem, of course, has been because Uganda has been used by the U.S. to provide support to the SPLA. In return, Khartoum has provided support to the LRA to fight the SPLA. I am very encouraged to hear you talk about the need now to have a strong international mandate to support Mrs. Betty Bigombe in this effort, because without it, we are aware that about 51–52% of the budget of Uganda is based on aid, and without a strong commitment from the aid donors to this resolution of this conflict, the Uganda government on its own perhaps would not be making these commitments that you have heard about. Thank you.
Yeah, why don't we take a question from Jamera in the back there, and we'll John.
Hi, Jamera Roan, Human Rights Watch. I have two questions. Thank you very much for your presentation, by the way. Very, very good. Could you, with regard to the disarray within the rebel movements or movement in Darfur, could you say who you think from Eritrea, from within the SPLA, from Chad, from other countries, who are the key players with regard to those rebel groups, and are they being heard at all? And also, as far as the GIM goes, from within Sudan, and I'm troubled by the lack of accountability, or the probable lack of accountability in northern Uganda. You mentioned monitors. Are you referring to human rights monitors? And isn't there some way that there can be accountability in northern Uganda, including for abuses in 1986, that would not leave us in a total state of impunity? It's somewhat contradictory that you have very strongly advocated war crimes and other accountability in Darfur, yet not in northern Uganda.
Thank you for that. You follow me around, and just every once in a while, and it isn't that infrequent, when I contradict myself, Jameer is always there. Should I just go for it? Okay. Ben, thank you for that input. I think that what you've said reinforces the need to have the U.S. as a real partner in this peace process. I see President Museveni as someone who certainly is pulled in the direction of the military approach to ending the conflict, if I can say that gently. And he, after years of seeing his military perform very, very poorly and be rotten with corruption and embarrassed regularly after very strong pronouncements that the rebellion was almost over and la la la, and there were only a few people left in the bush, and then have massive attacks occur, and just humiliations in my view. I think he finally sees that for all the reasons I said at the beginning, that there is a real chance for a military success, and that's very seductive. And it will demonstrate real leadership. It will require real leadership in order to put aside that possibility, because it is fairly remote, and to prioritize the peace track. It takes courage. It takes political courage, and I think that political courage would be the chances of him exercising that political courage would increase dramatically if the U.S. was a partner with him and a senior, and he was hearing from President Bush or the Secretary of State that it mattered to the United States that he pursues that. If he doesn't hear from us, nobody else matters. That's the truth. And the Brits can say all they want, the Dutch or whoever other people in this troika. But so I appreciate your comments. And I think that it's very important, by the way, that at this juncture, that the diaspora, the Ugandan diaspora, really weigh in positively with the links that you have with the various actors that are on the ground, like Betty and like the senior people on both sides who do listen. And I think that in the case of Uganda, the diaspora will be an integral element in whether or not a peace process unfolds positively in Uganda in the next 6 months. Jamira, I think in terms of who the key people are, who the key actors are in influencing the SLA and the GEM, you named them. The SIS is important. Garang and Salva are important, but the problem is that there is, as I said, with the deterioration of the command and control, the fact that SIS can talk to the top 15 people in the SLA may not make a great deal of difference to the rank and file. I mean, what I found, and now it's been three trips to Darfur in the last 8 months, is in talking to SLA mostly because they're 90% of the game in on the field, despite the GEM's excellent public relations, is that you have people who have their own motivations in these small units all over the place, mostly revenge-based, and sharing some vague form of ideology, that the Darfurian people ought to have more say in their affairs and whatever, blah, blah, blah. But it's really, this is a grudge match it's entered in a new phase where, as victims of a extraordinary ethnic cleansing campaign, that there's going to be there's going to be retribution. And I'm just not so sure now with the destruction of that command and control and the inability of Minnie or Abdul Wahid or any of these people to have any influence over people in the field, that Isaias or Garang, and particularly Garang, because people are expecting a lot from this guy as he goes into his new position. I don't know how much influence he can possibly have over the situation there. I think it's vastly overblown. It's underanalyzed. And we have to be realistic about how little. We're going to have to get into the weeds as to who in the Chadian army is connected to which units in the SLA in the field, and that kind of stuff. If we really want to, and this is why I say we can't just be sending junior officers to occasional peace conferences or wherever they have them in Abuja, because those guys don't have a clue about what's going on in Darfur. And we have to have people who have good at political analysis of what's happening. That means they have to go. That means they have to at least go to the camps in Chad and be talking to people, go to the border, and if they can't actually go into Darfur and talk to people, I don't know what the restrictions are. But and that is going to be a prerequisite for success at the table. And who's even talking about that? I mean, that's a layer of. It took years for us to make this point. And I say that us because we've been, even when I worked inside the administration, in order to press senior officials, if you care about an issue, then you're going to have to invest in it. It's not just going to be the occasional person that shows up at a peace conference. You've got to have that day-to-day engagement that requires some significant analysis, and I don't think we have the capacity right now to be able to answer the very important question that you ask about how we can influence the rebels and how can a peace deal be delivered. Now that, by the way, I'm not absolving. I think the principal responsibility for not having forward movement at the talks is not the rebels, but you asked about them, so I'm answering them. Okay, on what I meant by monitors in northern Uganda was ceasefire monitors. Yes, human rights monitors, that's a whole other kettle of fish that's very important, and we need to deploy as many as possible. International presence. But in what I was specifically referring to in the case of if there is a ceasefire agreed to between the LRA and the government of Uganda, is that the expectation is that there will be ceasefire monitors deployed so that at the minimum you can see if somebody is grotesquely violating whatever has been agreed to. And as part and parcel of that, though, when you want to get international presence in, then human rights monitors would be crucial to increase the number from the UN Human Rights Commission and others. On the accountability, yeah, it's a torturous issue, and we're deeply divided within my own organization about it, frankly. And since Gareth is coming here next week, I think I'll minimize how much I reveal about the internal machinations of our own position on the ICC in Uganda. Let's say there is a view within the organization, some within the organization, that it is crucial because the ICC and the credibility of the ICC, I guess, is at stake, that there has to be some action that the ICC takes finally to demonstrate that all this research and all this work is, it means something. And so so I think the ICC itself feels, and if anybody wants to correct me or stand up and say that's ridiculous, please do so, because this is my understanding of where it is the ICC feels some pressure to move forward on the Uganda indictments. They feel they have the evidence necessary to issue these indictments, and that by not doing it, they've given some time. They could have done this some months ago. They haven't. They've given some time for the Bigombe effort to unfold. And that time, that clock is ticking louder every day, and they could issue any time in the next month. And some people would support that, and others would say that, oh, wait a minute, we have for the first time in 18 years a potential for a resolution here. Can't you wait another couple of more months to see if the LRA is serious or not? And we're going to know in the next couple of months. So why hurl a wrench into the spokes of that bicycle moving forward? So that this is the dispute, and I think that, quite frankly, there is a strong rationale for both sides. I mean, in the case of Sudan, I think it's a no-brainer. The ICC is the right answer, and it's now, and that's a form of serious pressure to refer it. And the good thing about the ICC, in fact, Samantha Power has just written a very good op-ed that hopefully will get out very soon, and her point is that, and I think that it would be the point of Ocampo, would be that, the ICC, as opposed to a tribunal, if you set up a specific tribunal, sorry, I'm making a sub-point here, I'll try to come back in a second. The tribunal, specialized tribunals have end dates. Okay, so the Sierra Leone court, the tribunal for Rwanda, all these guys are ending soon. And so there's time pressure, no matter what's going on in the country, to finish the job and do it. Now, with the ICC, there isn't that end date. You can calibrate and time and sequence your activities with a larger context in mind, i.e. peace and human rights. Not that they're exclusive, but that they go as a package hand in hand. And so therefore, in the case of Sudan, having some defined end date is going to put more pressure on any particular, and who knows what kind of peace process will be unfolding over the next year, 2, 3, whatever. And there will be less of that kind of flexibility that you have in the ICC, where you can issue or not issue, which makes then, coming back to the main argument, is it makes more sense, or it makes sense to me that the ICC retain that flexibility maximally, and despite the pressures, and move forward when it's certain that they won't undermine the peace process in Uganda. So I'm not saying that they ought to not continue their very important activity of collecting the evidence and building the dossiers regarding the crimes against humanity that have been committed. But I do think that there are times when in peace processes such an external ingredient will actually potentially be poisonous.
Yeah, just time for a few more. Why don't we take these two questions right here, and then John, you can sum it up. So right here, and then woman back there. Yeah.
Hi, John. My name is Jeffrey. I'm from the Carter Center. I have two questions. One is just sort of a follow-up to the ICC issue in northern Uganda. I just want to know Ms. Betty Bigombe's position on ICC and how she sees how it affects the peace process. And also, the other issue is on southern Uganda, southern Sudan. If the implementation of the Nairobi Agreement is going to go well, we anticipate that John Garang will be sitting in Khartoum very soon as vice president of the government. I don't know how his presence within the government is going to affect the government's position in its approach to Darfur. So I just want to hear your comment on that.
And then back there.
Yes, Paulette Lee. And Colin Powell brought Sudan to the public attention. However, in her confirmation hearings, there seemed to be very little, if there was anything, I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt, to Secretary of State Rice. Does this cause you any concern in terms of the attention that will be paid to this part of the world by the administration? Thank you.
Can we squeeze in one more? You had your... Yeah.
Yodit Fidigu, Refugees International. I wanted to ask you, what is your perception of the Acholi people about the government's sincerity towards the achieving peace? Is there optimism or not? And do you have a sense that the conflict will be over and the 1 million plus people will be able to return home? Thank you.
Okay, Jeffrey, you asked about the position of Betty on the ICC. Did I get you right at the beginning? Yeah, I mean, I think that everybody involved in the peace talks feels that on the ground, involved in the peace talks, feels that a premature issuing those indictments at this particular juncture would be destabilizing, at the least, potentially process ending. And again, if somebody has a different interpretation or view on this, I welcome it. But that is my interpretation of everyone on the ground there. Then, with respect to Garang and his impact on Darfur as he becomes, and the SPLM becomes integrated into the government, into the central government in Khartoum, I think that Darfur will potentially be a piece to implement a very threatening variable to the implementation of the peace deal. There are going to be, it's the same crowd who orchestrated for years some of the most virulent forms of counterinsurgency against the SPLA itself are orchestrating those same, and with even deadlier efficiency, strategies in Darfur, and they don't have any interest in changing their course of action at this juncture, despite what President Bashir says about wanting peace in the next week or whatever he said last. And so I think that this is going to be a very, very big showdown internally. Whether we see that reflected quickly, and I mean, I don't think that he's going to make that a signature issue. I think that the strategy will be to build up as quickly as possible the protective infrastructure around the establishment of the government of Southern Sudan, which is the beachhead for the SPLM's transition. And once the beachhead is established, then we'll go up to Khartoum. We'll figure out who's got what jobs, and we'll start dealing on the national level. The variable, the external variable that comes into play is the desperation of the Americans and the Norwegians and the British and the Secretary General, who will want Garang to play ball now on Darfur. And you see a great deal of resistance in the leadership of the SPLA saying, oh, wait a minute. You don't even understand what's going on in Darfur, first of all, and what our role is. And second of all, we got other priorities. And all we hear is that you're going to condition your assistance to the South on what's happening in Darfur. So there is some resistance there. I think that partly has been overcome. Garang is very accommodating, so he's accepted that there'll be some kind of hotline between him and Taha on Darfur, and that there's going to be some effort to coordinate in the coming months on the negotiations. But I think that there are other forces at play here, and that the SPLA has higher priorities than to immediately play ball on Darfur, because it will be a threatening and point of major contention between hardliners in the regime and the SPLM sort of general position, which is to be much more supportive of the rebels in Darfur. To your question, Paulette, about whether the lack of sort of public statements by Secretary Rice is of concern about, I don't know. I mean, these guys, when they're quiet, I get more nervous when they're not saying what they're going to do. And I think that Khartoum may well feel the same way. I mean, here's someone who certainly appears to have had a bit of a stronger position than Secretary Powell did vis-a-vis Sudan. And I think we're going to see a harder line policy emerge on the human rights questions the peace process in Naivasha was Secretary Powell's signature contribution. It was one of his legacy issues. It was quite clear from the staff meetings that his own people participated in, and to his friends and others, that this was an issue that he was going to work on assiduously, and he did. And to his credit, it was he was partly responsible for the deal being done, aside from all the other mistakes that were made. And that in that context, it was quite an achievement. But the cost of that was that he played the Darfur policy card very softly, and he pursued a policy of constructive engagement. I think that was enabling to the entire campaign waged by the government of Sudan. So I don't think we're going to see that kind of accommodation from the new secretary. I don't think this is purely because she hasn't spoken much on the thing publicly, and we don't know really where she's coming from. But I think we'll get a bit of a policy review on this, and that the forces that want to see a harder line policy on the part of the U.S. government coming out of Congress, and which is the chorus is just increasing from Congress, that they have to be, there has to be some accountability in Darfur. And from within the administration, we'll find a more receptive ear in the new secretary than the old one, even if she doesn't say much about it. And maybe she's not saying much about it because there is some discussion. What is the Acholi people's perception of the process, and whether I think that it's a very confusing process, because the newspapers are just the worst. Rumor mongers and momentum players. As on New Year's Eve, when Museveni sort of ended the ceasefire, and there was some statement made by someone about the failure of the talks. I mean, the entire North, along with much of the world, thought that this process was dead. It was far from dead. It was a setback, like every peace process has. Every third day, everywhere in the world. I mean, and it was a difficult one, but they've gotten through that, and we're back on track, and la la la. So I think that there is a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding of what's happening in the process. I mean, you can't conduct a peace process through the press. You can't conduct it in, you can do public diplomacy, but the public diplomacy that comes out of the Ugandan government is almost exclusively unhelpful. And inflammatory. And so that is not really, so people are very confused about what's really going on and what's happening. And I think that there is a role for outsiders to play in disseminating neutral information about the process, disseminating neutral information about what the ICC is trying to do and what the objective of an ICC investigation is, because people don't get that either. And those that do get it, many of them disagree with it. So, so I think that there is a great deal of room that is needed for public education and mobilization on some of these basic questions of how the peace process unfolds and how accountability for not only what's happened recently but also going back can possibly be achieved.
Thanks, John. We've unfortunately come to the end of our discussion. You can find a summary of today's events. We'll post it on our website, which is wilsoncenter.org, and then you can find John's op-eds and other articles on the International Crisis Group website, which is crisisweb.org. Please do join me in thanking John, and thank you for coming, and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, we brought the delegation over here. It was fantastic. So I work really closely with the judges whenever they have a delegation of give up to highlight their, give them exposure. And because they were the factors. And what I really enjoyed about it is that all sectors of the community we could negotiate these divides and work together. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually came on, my son's a teacher, being involved in classes and it's fun. And actually when they had you make yourself more into the really interesting.
Let's do that.
Nice to meet you.
You too. Very good. I agree with
As we go along.
I don't actually know. Yeah, I will try
I know. How are you? Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Wow. You're back from Sudan.